Okay. Again, so the topic today is on financial stewardship. When I came 8 years ago, we owed on the church building, and we immediately had 2 furnaces die on us, and then we had the air conditioner units stole on us. Well, it's very interesting. In 8 years, we've paid for 2 new air conditioner units and furnaces. They had to put a new roof on too before I got here, and that's paid for, done for. The church mortgage, you might say, they usually put out, everyone welcome, mortgage is paid, you know. But the mortgage is paid, you know, that's really neat. And we built up a reserve.
Praise God.
So that if the furnace dies, we can replace it. If the roof gets in trouble, we can replace it. We built up a reserve. And that is amazing. And that is really great. So the topic, financial stewardship, is like preaching to the choir, you know. But here's a statement for that topic would be, the New Testament, by principle and example, teaches that the work of the church is to be supported by the financial stewardship of its members. Tithing, a tenth, as a biblical principle, serves as an appropriate standard of giving. Motivated by love, each member is called upon to give tithes and offerings freely and cheerfully. Short statement, but it's a nice one, of how we should do. So I wanted to go through some verses on both sides of this, on why we do it and the blessings that are to go along with it. And of course we start in Genesis. I've got a separate sheet on some other things on the side, and I'll kind of sprinkle them in here. But I want to go to Genesis chapter 14. The fan seems to be humming overhead. I'm hoping that is not being recorded. That doesn't get in the machine, but I can hear it. Going vroom, vroom, vroom. Should I just stop it? Might be wise. Oh, it went away right away. I just barely had to touch it. It's much quieter, right?
Yes.
Okay. Genesis 14, verse 18 through 20. So chapter 14, verse 18 through 20. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine, and he was the priest of the Most High God. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram of the Most High God, possessor of the heaven and earth. And blessed be the Most High God, which hath delivered thine enemies into thy hand. And he gave him tithes of all. The measurement of tithe here is not said exactly what the amount would be, but we understand it's 10%. And later we'll get a verse that has that. But he gave tithes of all. There had to be some layout yet of how to tithe. If you have cattle and you're tithing, you take a tenth and you give it to the Lord. What about the newborns of the cattle and so on? How about the next year? There was rules about the firstborn and all kinds of things that came along later. But we know this is the first example of tithing, and Abraham did it. But what about some offerings? Because the Old Testament has a lot of offerings in it. The New Testament talks about alms that you give at times. So we want to run into a few of those verses too. But this is the first example where Abraham paid tithe to this very special person, Melchizedek. Not much is said about him, but it references to Jesus. Very interesting. So if you look up his name and look up all of his life, it is surprising of what you'll find. Very interesting study on its own, but I won't be able to do that right now. But let's go to Hebrews chapter 7. The book of Hebrews chapter 7. Hebrews 7, starting with verse 1. For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him, to whom also Abraham gave a tenth, there you go, tenth part of all, first being by interpretation, king of righteousness. This is the king, Melchizedek, king of righteousness. And after that also king of Salem, which is king of peace, without father, without mother, without descent, without grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and probably before that, there's no record of this person, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like unto the Son of God, abideth as a priest continually. Wow, we don't know enough to put down stakes, but really it's surprising statements here, isn't it? I don't like to make doctrines on one verse or two. Should always have plenty of verses to make a firm statement. Verse 4, now consider how great this man was, unto whom even the patriarch Abraham gave a tenth of the spoils. Again, tenth is named. And verily, they that are of the sons of Levi, who received the office of the priesthood, have a commandment to take the tithes of the people according to the law, that is, of their brethren, though they came out of the loins of Abraham. But he whose descent, again that word, of pedigree, the margin says, is not counted of them, received tithes of Abraham, and blessed him, and that had the promise. So I'm going to stop there. We wanted to get the tenth again and the tithe mentioned. And who are they? Who was Melchizedek? We don't really know. Were they supposed to give tithes to somebody other than the Levites and the priests? And here Melchizedek got the same, got the tithes. Interesting. So those thoughts are in this verse, saying that this was right. It was okay to do that. Because the sons of Levi, you'd have to study another idea. Where was their background? How did they come to be the tithe of the 12 tribes? And how is it that they were sustained with the tithes of the other members of the family, the 12 tribes of Israel? So you almost had like a 13th tribe here that was receiving tithes from the others. It's kind of interesting, if there was 12 tribes paying tithe, what percentage is that? They were living on 90%, and the Levites and priests got the other percentage, so they were living on 110%, right, or 120%. Well, there was more expenses. They were virtually the school teachers. They were the teachers of the law, the teachers of this or that, and they had to maintain the church building and do the labor for the church and all other kinds of things that were done. There was a lot of things that involved something there that we don't quite grasp. But that's interesting, that they were paid for their work in the church. So then let's go to another place in Genesis 28, because we have somebody else paying tithe long before the law was given, before Moses' time. So Genesis 28. And in verse 20 and and 22, down to 22. So starting with verse 20. So I'm in Genesis 28, verse 20. And Jacob vowed a vow, saying, if God will be with me and will keep me in the way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and raiment to put on, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then shall the Lord be my God. And Lord is capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D. I wrote in the side of my page, Yahweh. If God would do that for him, and he would come again to his father's house. I lost my place here. Raiment, come in peace to him. Yes, okay, in verse 22. And this stone, which I have set for a pillar, shall be God's house. And of all that thou hast given me, I will surely give the 10th unto thee. The 10th. So again, 10th is mentioned. And you know, he went away with next to nothing, and when he came back, he was very wealthy. Gave a 10th of all. Sometimes we'd say, is there another way around this? That's human thinking, isn't it? But he was saying here, if God would feed him and clothe him and keep him in health and so on, would bring him back to this place, he would be glad to give the 10th of everything that he gained while he was away. So he'd come back and give it. And you know, that's a thing for us to look at and think, you know, God does that. God gives us tremendous blessings day by day. Sometimes we can't see it. I joke, you know, how can you tell if your toothpaste lasts 10% longer? You know, but really, if you look at how God takes care of us, sometimes you're just shocked. Wow, look at this piece of machinery that we have, and it's yay many years old. This is unusual. God protected it. God kept it going. God did this for us or that for us. So we're trying to measure. Well, I'm going to get to a verse where God says, try me out. I'll show you. Just give me a try. I'll prove it to you. Okay, so let's keep going. So this was long before Moses' time. I'm going to go here to Numbers. The book of Numbers. And chapter 18. And then verse 21 through to 24. So again, talking about the 10th. And behold, I have given the children of Levi all the 10th of Israel for an inheritance, for their sacrifice which they served, even the service of the tabernacle of the congregation. Neither must the children of Israel henceforth come nigh the temple, the tabernacle, of the congregation, lest they bear sin and die. They were not allowed to come where the Levites could go, in the temple and the tabernacle. They were not allowed to go there. God says, I'll take the Levites. They're going to do this job. So this was God's plan, God's way. And the Levites and all the 10th of Israel. Let's see, I need a couple more verses here. For the Levites shall do the service of the tabernacle of the congregation, and they shall bear their iniquity. It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations, that among the children of Israel they have no inheritance, no other inheritance of the land, buildings, and so on. They didn't have any other inheritance. This was it. In verse 24, but the tithes of the children of Israel, which they offer as a heave offering unto the Lord, I have given to the Levites to inherit. Therefore I have said unto them, among the children of Israel they shall have no inheritance. There was rules about when they were cooking. There was a certain that went to the Levites. When they were giving sacrifices, there was a certain cut or a certain quarter or piece of meat that went to the Levites. These are in other rules, other ways that they had this as their inheritance. They had towns where they live, and their buildings in those towns they would use. They didn't own them. They virtually were renting, paying rent for free. But there was a different way of inheritance. You couldn't pass this inheritance to their son as the other tribes did. If their sons were Levites and they did the Levites' job, of course they could live there and so on. That was their kind of inheritance. So the children of Israel had that special thing. Now this is, again, prior to Moses, prior to writing these down. So we like to look at this as a standard of God from the beginning all the way through to the end of the Bible. It's a standard all the way across the way. And it has worked fantastically for the children of Israel. And people often say we wish the American government would go on a straight tax, 10%. We'd be well off. Everybody pay a tenth of what they earn. We'd be okay. Okay, so then I want to go to Malachi. We're just at the end of the Old Testament. And we want to see 400 years before Jesus comes, what God had to say at that time. Malachi chapter 3. I'm going to start with verse 8. God is talking with them and kind of correcting them, straightening things out, putting things right. And then in verse 8 he says, "Will a man rob God? Yet ye have robbed me. But ye say, Wherein have we robbed thee? And God replies, In tithes and in offerings. Ye are cursed with a curse, for ye have robbed me." You're robbing God. Even this whole nation. It wasn't just singling out one or the other, the whole nation. He said, this is where you're wrong. Verse 10, "Bring ye all the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be meat in mine house, and prove me now herewith, saith the Lord of hosts, if I will not open you the windows of heaven, and pour you out a blessing, that there shall not be room enough to receive it." I like some of these verses where it uses this, there won't be room enough to receive it, or you'll have this real difficult problem where you need to eat up the old supply because it's getting older, and the new supply is coming in already. Now, what do? God is blessing. God is blessing. Those are wonderful things to see and to know about. So here he says, you've robbed him because they weren't giving their tithes and their offerings. And offerings is mentioned there. And he said, you wonder why you've got a problem. Why is your land in a problem? Why is your animals not producing like they should produce, or the milk production, or anything, your vegetable production, your grain is not producing as good as it ought to. You wonder why. He said, it's because you're cursed. You're robbing the Heavenly Father. So then he says that they should bring it into the storehouse, that there would be meat in my house. That means the Levites would be able to live. The Levites would be able to run the church service. They'd be able to do things that would bring the spiritual life back to the whole nation. So that there would be meat there. But then he says, prove me. He says, go ahead and try it. Test me out. See if it works. See if I won't open the windows of heaven and pour out a blessing. It's actually amazing. We don't try God more often. Amen. But Pearl and I shouldn't tell it myself, should I? But we watched a video recording in 1995 on financial stewardship. It was done by another organization, very good one. And we were happy to be able to preview it for the General Conference, and they were going to make copies of it and send it to each district and have it moved, passed around to all the churches, because it was a very good video. Well, I don't know if they did all of that, but I watched it and gave a report on it, and I thought it was really good, and immediately moved to Walla Walla, Washington area. So I don't know what this district did, but I came back. Anyway, Pearl and I took note of some of those things in that video, and then we actually did partial seminars on it, by showing the video and having people look at the materials that were in books that you could get booklets that went with it as a lesson. And then we found that we were getting too personal and the people couldn't put in all the words that might go with it. So we had to just say, carry on, here's your booklet. Carry on. If you want to borrow the rest of the video, you can. Here's a table that you can use. Here's a budget that you can use. But we couldn't do it personally to each one. That wasn't fair on them, or ask us to even do that isn't right. But that was such a blessing for Pearl and I, and we were getting into debt because we're kind of living off of a credit card because we moved. I only had a few hours of work with Sears there in Walla Walla, and the church was only paying me a very partial salary, very small salary, and Pearl had no work. We got into a rental. Some people kept us in their home for a while, and then we knew that we needed to move along, So we got our own rental, and we were just touch and go. And I don't know, I think I could say in a year we're completely out of debt. Was it that fast?
Not quite, but pretty close.
Not quite that fast, but pretty close. Car was paid off. All the other bills were paid off. All the credit cards were paid off. So, wow, God, is that right? He said, prove me. We tried it. Okay. Been a pastor many years, and now you say, well, why didn't you try it before that? I know. Truth is right. Okay. We were like everybody else. You think, well, you need to get in debt in a credit card. Or you need to do this, or you need to do that, or you need to spend money on things that you really shouldn't spend money on. And it gets you into trouble. We weren't terribly bad off, but I've heard of people that are in real trouble. And then you hear about people on TV that if you're over so many thousands and thousands of dollars to the IRS, you ought to take their advice and go to their counseling. So, and I think, wow, what a blessing to be where we are. That we could pay off that credit card every month. Or don't spend money. Right? Okay. But God said, try me. And I was actually shocked to know that that was working for us. In fact, God had done it before, and we should have known better. When we went to Michigan, we still owed our gas bills for crossing country for a whole year because we couldn't afford to pay it off. And in a matter of months, again, totally out of debt. What was the difference? Just the blessing of God. So we need to try Him every so often. Say, okay, Lord, I'm going to obey what I know is right, and I know you're going to bless me for it. Okay, so let's keep going. That's Malachi. I wanted to, I wrote out some scriptures here, so I'm going to put these in here. I looked up the word content, or be content. And I thought that goes along with getting the bills paid off. What is a contentment that you don't have to have this so that you can pay that? Even some wisdom, if you get in debt over here, how about if you put this on the credit card, take that money and pay this so you get less interest rate? There's some wisdom that the Bible can give us. There's a lot on finance in the Bible, just a lot. So here's something about being content. In Luke 3, verse 14, it says, the soldiers likewise demanded of him, that's Jesus, saying, and what shall we do? And he said unto them, do no violence to no man, neither accuse any falsely, and be content with your wages. That's in Luke chapter 3, verse 14. Be content with your wages. I've worked at all kinds of jobs. I have 5 trades. So I've worked at all kinds of jobs all over the place. And people generally complain about what they're getting. It doesn't matter whether it's small or more. I had a boss that was billing out at $100 an hour and taking home $50 an hour, and he was complaining. Didn't have enough money. We need to be different as Christians, right? We need to say, I'm going to be content with what God gives me, and God will supply all of our needs, not the luxury. Maybe not the ice cream and the pie, and it's bad for your health. Okay, but God will supply all of our needs. So be content with our wages. Philippians 4, verse 11 Not that I speak in respect of want, for I have learnt, in whatsoever state I am, therewith to be content. I say, see, it said whatever state, Missouri, or, oh. No, it's covering even more ground than that, right? When we have sufficient, we should realize that God has given us that sufficiency, and don't go after all the other things that you don't need. God will supply our needs, and it will be a blessing to us. To be content and to be happy with those things that God does supply for us. In Timothy, it says, 1 Timothy 6 and verse 8, and having food and raiment, let us be therewith content. The basics. We want to be fed. We want to have sufficient for warm clothing. We want a roof over our heads. And God supplies all those things. He said He will. But we sure don't need all of the extra luxuries that could go along with some of those things. In Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 5, let your conversation be without covetousness. Whoa. You see all the ads on TV? You've got to have this truck. Or you've got to have this item that they're selling. They really push it. Without covetousness. We don't need to covet this certain vehicle or that certain vehicle or this. We need transportation. That's the world we live in. But boy, the world wants to push other things on us that causes covetousness. And be content with such things as ye have. For He hath said, I will never leave thee nor forsake thee. He knows what we need. He's going to supply. He's going to be there for us, going to be with us. I can remember when I got my first decent computer. It was a Commodore. And I was probably 10 years behind the time at that. And it worked just perfect for my needs. It was just good. I wished I'd still ran. I wished it still worked. I wished I still had it with me. Because all of the problems that we have with this newfangled stuff and all of the changes that kept going on, 386, 486, 586, and Pentium, and on and on and on and on and on. Windows this and Windows that and Windows that, and all they're doing is taking your money. They make it go out of date so they can take more money from you. Somewhere we have to say, I'm going to be content. I know there's times when I feel badly because of pastoral work, because of communication work. I have to keep up about so far. I have to be maybe one step behind others, but you have to, because the world just won't communicate with you if you don't. The Windows program was working just fine. Your program was DOC, DOX, when you made a document. No, not DOC, document. And now you got to have a DOCX, or they can't communicate with you. So, anyway, we can be content and one step behind the others and just be as happy as a lark. And God will take care of us, and the price is better too. Then there's a statement that catches us every once in a while in Romans 13, verse 8. Owe no man anything. Wow. And if you look in some of the other connections with this, if you don't pay the last penny, they can put you in jail. Remember that statement? You'll stay in jail until the very last penny is paid. Because you become a slave to who you owe money to. So that verse in Romans 13, verse 8, all of the verse reads this way. Owe no man anything, but to love one another, for he that loveth another hath fulfilled the law. A great verse to go by, and part of the money in the front of it, or owe them because you didn't give them the love that they deserve, or their proper treatment that they deserve. We should not be owing somebody. Then the word alms, in Matthew 6, verse 1, take heed that ye do not your alms before men to be seen of them, otherwise ye have no reward of your Father which is in heaven. You're going to get a thank you from the person that see you, or you give and they'll say thank you. And that's all you're going to get. Where if you do it in secret, God can give those blessings to you. In Matthew, the same chapter, Matthew 6, verse 2, 3, and 4, I'm going to read. Therefore, when thou doest thine alms, do not sound the trumpet before thee, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may have glory of men. Verily I say unto you, they have their reward. Next verse. But when thou doest alms, let not thy left hand know what thy right hand doeth. Wow, that's secretive to even your own body, or husband and wife sometimes. If you feel you need to give, that can be the rule there. Next verse. That thine alms may be in secret, and thy Father which seeth in secret himself shall reward thee openly. That's the best way to have it. One more place here in Acts chapter 10, verse 2 and 4 and 31. Verse 2 says, a devout man, and one that feared God, with all his house, which gave much alms to the people, and prayed to God always. Special person that was not Hebrew. And he was doing it right. He feared God, and he gave much alms. So that seems to be important. Verse 4 says, and when he looked on him, he was afraid, and said, what is it, Lord? In chapter 4. And he said unto him, thy prayers and thine alms are come up for a memorial before God. This is still Cornelius from the first verses of that chapter. He saw a vision, and he said, what is it? And the answer was, thine prayers and thine alms are come up as a memorial before God. Isn't that neat? If we do it right, if we give at the right time, and we do the things that would be normal, spiritual way of giving alms and giving prayers and so on, God's going to remember it. God's going to take note of it. There's a book where it says that he's going to write it in his book of remembrance. That's in Malachi. Okay. And then Acts 10:31, and said, Cornelius, thy prayer is heard, and thine alms are had in remembrance in the sight of God. Those are great things to think of, that something that we can do spiritually that will bring us blessings. So going on kind of quickly here now, I want to go to Luke chapter 11. Luke chapter 11. And verse 42. But woe unto you, scribes, unto you, Pharisees, for ye tithe mint and rue, and all manner of herbs, and pass over judgment, and the love of God. These ought ye to have done, and not to leave the other undone. It's saying both are needed to be done. It's really what it is. It's a way of love. It's a love of showing love to God, showing love to your fellow man by doing these things of tithing with the, not just that they were looking for praise, that, I did it for the herbs as well as, no, that's not the way we do things. That's not going to bring a blessing. Do you remember in Matthew 23:23? I want to grab this one quickly. Matthew 23:23. Jesus was often asked about things, or mentioned the same thing, the tithing and that. So here we're back with the Pharisees. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for ye pay tithes of mint and anise and cumin, and have omitted the weightier matters of the law, judgment, mercy, and faith. These ought you to have done, and not to leave the other undone. Again, he's naming who he's talking to, and he called them hypocrites. You pay tithe. No. You should give your tithes. Belong to God already. Just give it to him. Right? You don't pay tithe like, I have to do it, No, this is, they were paying tithe. They should have actually been giving to the Lord. And then he says what they were doing, that they should have looked after the weightier matters of the law, judgment. We need to make good, wise determinations and helping people with injustices where we can say, no, you're wrong doing that. This is the way it ought to be. We can help people along through life. And mercy, having mercy on people and those that are out of synchronization with some of the worldly things. We need to have mercy on them, show them faith and teach them faith. Those would be the blessings that we could give to others. One more verse here is in Luke chapter 18. Luke chapter 18 and verse 12. 18 verse 12. Do you remember the Pharisee that went up to pray and the publican that went up to pray? And the Pharisee says, I fast twice in a week. I give tithes of all and all that I possess. He was making it a point, he's got to tell God, I'm doing all this. Here you are, Lord, add up this lot. He's keeping records of everything that he did for the Lord. And that wasn't acceptable because who went out of there blessed? Not the Pharisee. Okay. So we shouldn't brag about these things and hold them up in front of situations of life. We'd be better off doing other things. Okay, I think I got, did that one. Let's go to 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Starting with verse 7. Who goeth a warfare any time on his own charges? This is an interesting verse that is kind of put in here in the middle of this. But you have to know that Paul was instructing the Corinthians to give to the furthering of the gospel. And he's saying, who goes to war on their own? Doesn't somebody support them? Give them money to go? Provide the tools? We need to take some wisdom from it, is what's happening here. So who goes on his own charges? Who planteth a vineyard and eateth not the fruit thereof? Or who feedeth the flock and eateth not the milk of the flock? And say I these things as a man? Or say not the law the same also? He's saying, I want you to make a judgment call. I want you to think this through. He said, am I telling you this just because I want you to give money to that cause or to this or to me? He was a missionary. And he said, I'm not saying this as a man. He's saying that this is something that we need to find a reason for doing because it's the right thing to do. Look back through the scriptures. Find out how they did things and how they handled the situations. And then we say, oh, okay, we can do the same. He says, doesn't the law say the same thing? In the next verse, for it is written in the law of Moses. Okay, now he's going to quote for you. Thou shalt not muzzle the mouth of the ox that treadeth out the corn. Doth God take care of the oxen? Of course he does. It's a redundant question, right? God cares for the oxen. And he says, here's a law. When the ox is going around in a circle and grinding for you, you don't muzzle him. When you're taking the wheat field or oat field or the corn cobs, let that animal take one of those every so often while he's going along. Because that's the right thing to do. He should have that ability. Then in verse 10, or saith he it altogether for our sakes, for us to reconsider, to think on. For our sake, no doubt, this is written, that he that ploweth should plow with hope, and he that threshes in hope should be the partaker of his hope. If we have sown unto you spiritual things, is it a great thing that we should also reap your carnal things? I think that's one more verse, I guess. If others partake of this power over you, are not we rather, nevertheless, we have not used this power, but suffer all things, lest we should hinder the gospel of Christ. Do ye not know that they which minister about holy things live of the things of the temple, and they which wait at the altar are partakers of the altar? So there's just reminiscing a little bit. They're saying, isn't this so? Isn't that so? Isn't that the way it was done? And he's bringing it back to the leaders of the Christian faith when they're going out. Do they need to be sent? Do they need to have coats or papers or Bibles or whatever they might need on the way? And he's saying that even the food in the past was they were partakers of the temple. They could eat of the temple food because that's the way they were fed and cared for. And he's enough there to cover those topics about personal life of those that are spreading the gospel as well. He says, I didn't take this power, when he was saying earlier, I didn't demand this of you because he didn't need to. He felt he didn't need to. He was a tent maker. He worked with leather. So by doing that, he was able to spare the church from having to pay him. And actually, I've always found that very nice too. When I had 5 trades and I could work on one trade here and one trade there, or trade off, if I needed something, I could earn my own income. It lessened the load on the church. And I still do that. It's still that way. In fact, when we got to a conference meeting one time and they were begging for ministers to get back in the saddle, you might say, and I said to Pearl, we got to do this. We got to go back. We got to get back to work. I'd had bad car accident, bad health, bad surgery on my back, and I said, we got to get back to work. And I said, now, a year or so later, now that we're on Social Security, now we can afford to go back and pastor again. But it's true. It helps the local church to not have to carry the whole load. It's less on the local church. So that's great. And that's what Paul was doing. That's what he's talking about. But setting a standard that they should realize that they may have to hire a pastor and pay it. I'm going to go to 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 17 and 18. That the elders that rule well be counted worthy of double honor, especially they who labor in the word and the doctrine. For the scripture saith, thou shalt not muzzle the ox that treads out the corn, and the labor is worthy of his hire. There's been bad times in some churches we've heard about where there was not sufficient money for pastors, or the way the money was divided in the district, the pastors were just starving to death. Just a real problem with trying to serve the Lord. So they were deliberately made to go and work at part-time work, which they probably weren't even trained for, so they took really low jobs. And then somebody else would come along, another pastor, and say, well, he's not really serious with his ministry because he's not in it full time. We need to balance this somehow, right? There's a wisdom here somewhere. Okay, so let's keep going here. A couple more verses. Oh, I was there in 1 Corinthians, and I'm going to take you back because I wanted the 14th verse there as well, separately probably. 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 14. Even so hath the Lord ordained that they which preach the gospel should live of the gospel. There's the standard that should be for ministers. It's we're getting 2 phases of this. One is you've got to have enough ministers for every church. Then you've got to have churches that have enough money to pay those ministers. And where does this balance come in? It's up to us, right, to use our heads and to pray about it. And it's actually interesting if they hire, some of these churches I've looked at them, they're doing without a minister. If they hired a pastor, he pays tithes, right? There you go, your problem's probably solved. Okay. Okay. So yeah, some good wisdom there would help. 2 Corinthians chapter 9. This is my last verse. 2 Corinthians chapter 9. And verse 6 and 7. But this I say, he which soweth sparingly shall reap also sparingly. He which soweth bountifully shall reap also bountifully. Every man according as he purposeth in his heart, so let him give, not grudgingly, or of necessity, for God loveth a cheerful giver. May God bless you.